For as long as anybody can remember, the Christian church, as it spread around the globe, chose to celebrate its festivities based upon a calendar. You can imagine what it would be like if every church celebrated the resurrection at a different time. That'd be a little weird. And in some years, certain churches might forget Christmas. That'd be a little weird. So the early church put together this calendar. In fact, the church calendar that we use today, it was decided upon before the New Testament was decided upon. Before the books of the New Testament were canonized, the church had put together a calendar. Did you know, speaking of the New Testament being canonized, did you know that the early church decided what books would be in the New Testament right here in this area? It happened right here in Tunisia. In fact, there's going to be a tour during the second week of January that you can join if you want to, where we'll visit all the ancient sites of Carthage, the archaeological sites, and one of them will be where we can see exactly where the leaders of the early church gathered to decide what would be in the canon of the Bible. But anyway, I digress. So the church has this calendar, and it's got it from almost the very beginning. And for reasons that are too complicated to get into right now, the early church decided that Easter would be kind of near the spring equinox, and that Christmas would always fall right around the winter solstice. So, what that means is that today is the last day of our church calendar. Happy New Year. And so next Sunday we start a new year on the church calendar, which means next Sunday is Advent. So, Advent, the coming of Christmas, it all starts next week. But today is the last day of the church calendar. Also, as long as anyone can remember, the church has identified certain Bible readings for certain weeks. Now, churches don't have to follow these readings, and some churches don't. And even though we follow these readings here at this church, sometimes we might diverge from this lectionary, because of something else is more relevant to what's going on in the world at the time. But the idea of these designated readings on a designated day over the course of the year is that over the course of the year or three, we hear read to us a picture of the entire Bible, and not just the pastor's favorite verses. And for the last year, we have been reading in our gospel reading the book of Matthew. If you've been showing up and paying attention, then I'm sure you've noticed that most of our gospel readings have been the book of Matthew. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it. I've had a blast. I learned a lot. But today is our final gospel reading from the book of Matthew. And it's a great one. This final gospel reading from the book of Matthew, from Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. It's an iconic passage. It's a sermon that Jesus is giving. And sometimes, Jesus speaks in parables. And sometimes Jesus speaks in discourse, and sometimes he even speaks in poetry. But sometimes, like in this passage, he gives a sermon. And frankly, Jesus' sermons are far better than anything I could give you from up here. So actually, in a bit, I'm just going to reread this sermon of Jesus from a slightly different translation than what we just heard. This famous passage about the sheep and the goats This famous passage about the sheep and the goats, it's about the final judgment. It's about that day when the suffering servant will become the servant king. It's about that day when Jesus the Messiah, who reigns as King of heaven and earth, will separate all the people into two groups. And this passage brings up themes that we've heard over the past year as we've read through Matthew. It brings up this theme of separating people, like we saw in the parable of the wheat or the parable of the nets. And it brings up themes of producing fruit, like we heard in the parable of the renters of the vineyard, or the lesson of the fig tree, or the parable of the talents. In some ways, this final reading from the book of Matthew wraps up all these great themes that we've been hearing from the Gospel of Matthew. This is the perfect way for us to wrap up the end of our church year and the end of reading through the book of Matthew. And one of the things that we get from this great passage of the sheep and the goats is we see how God is concerned with the poor. It's striking that Jesus distinguishes those who give water to those who are the least of these. And of course, when he says the least of these, he's talking about people who are poor, and in some cases people who are disenfranchised, and in some cases people who are excluded from the community, and in some cases people who are looked down upon by the community, and in some cases people who are just under us by all of the ways that the world sees humans. There are people who might be designated as under us, and how we treat them is critical, is essential. And this great passage of the sheep and the goats, it tells us that the poor are somehow more important. It's an interesting thing when we read Jesus' words. My whole life, I grew up, probably most of you too, hearing things like, oh, God loves everybody the same. But you know what? I don't think that's true. I don't think that God does love everybody the same, because I think sometimes he loves the poor just a little bit more. And we hear that the person who's able to give sacrificially to the poor, or the person who's under them, is distinguished from everybody else. There's something else in this iconic passage of the sheep and the goats. And it starts out by describing Jesus as this great king. He was the reason that all things were created. Jesus was. He is the Lord of all that has ever been or ever will be. Jesus is. He's the source of all power. He's the source of all hope and of all beauty and of all righteousness. He is our king. He is the world's king. He is creation's king. And his reign, it was made valid. It was validated by his loving, selfless sacrifice on the cross for all mankind. And his rule will be forever over all creation. But a part of this rule of Jesus as the King of all things in heaven and earth involves separation. It involves judgment. That's what this iconic passage of the sheep and the goats tells us. Sometimes people make too much about, the left and the right, and this passage isn't about putting people on the left and the right and what the right means and what the left means. That's not what it's about. And sometimes people talk about who are the sheep and who are the goats, and it's not about sheep and goats and what they represent. It's simply describing the fact that sometimes in life people will separate things on the left side or the right side, or sometimes there are shepherds who will separate their goats and their sheep. Not that goats are worse than sheep or sheep are better than goats, but that there's a separation, and this separation on the surface, it might be hard to understand. You would be forgiven if you thought that this passage about separating the sheep and goats was about works salvation. Because on the surface, it kind of seems like this. It does. It kind of seems like Jesus is saying, if you do enough good things, you go over here. But if you don't do enough good things, you go over here. And I can tell you definitively, that is not what Jesus taught. That's not what he believes. And that's not the character of the God that created you and me. And it's so much more wonderful than that. This separation is not about people who do good and people who don't do enough good. It's about two types of people who ask two types of questions. There's a person who asks the question, Lord, I didn't know I was doing that to you. When I gave water to the thirsty person, I didn't know I was doing that to you. When I visited the lonely person, I didn't think I was doing that to you. And then there's the person who asks the question, Lord, wait, when were you thirsty? When were you lonely? If I had known, I would have done it. If I had known you were thirsty, for sure I would have given you some water. If I'd known you were in prison, I definitely would have come to visit you. When were you like this, my Lord? I would have done it because I want to receive. I would have given to you, of course. I don't need to give to people who are beneath me, but I would have given to you because I want to receive. I want to be in. And that's what this great iconic passage of the sheep and goats talks about as it's discussing separation. There's a person that wants to try to earn their way into this relationship with God that's only possible because of the sacrifice of Jesus. They want to earn it. They want to do enough, and they're convinced that they can do enough to get in. But Jesus' message is that if that's you, if you're the one who's asking the question, I didn't see you in need, so I didn't act, then you're the person who's going to be separated on the left. And the people who have been separated on the right from before there was time, the people that God chose from the beginning of the creation of the universe, they are the ones who give because they understand that Jesus is their king. It's about separating people those who recognize Jesus as their king and those who want to try to work to get something, work their way into the kingdom. And so this iconic passage from Matthew 25. When he finally arrives, blazing in beauty and all his angels with him, the Son of Man will take his place on his glorious throne. Then all the nations will be arranged before him, and he will sort the people out, much as a shepherd sorts out sheep and goats, putting sheep to his right and the goats to his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Enter you who are blessed by my Father. Take what is coming to you in this kingdom. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation, and here's why. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped to visit. I was in prison and you came to me. Then those sheep are going to say, Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you drink? And when did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you? Then the king will say, I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things for someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me. Then he will turn to the goats, the ones on the left, and he'll say, Get out, worthless goats, you're good for nothing but the fires of hell. And why? Because I was hungry and you gave me no meal. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was homeless and you gave me no bed. I was shivering and you gave me no clothes. Sick and in prison and you never visited. Then those goats are going to say, Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or homeless or shivering or sick or in prison and didn't help? He will answer them, I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you failed to do one of these things to someone who was being overlooked or ignored, that was me. You failed to do it to me. Then the goats will be herded to their eternal doom, but the sheep to their eternal reward. Amen.